Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is a special live episode of Dispatches. Nothing seems to stop Israel and its sponsor, the US, from carrying on with the most depraved atrocities of our time, first in Gaza and now in Lebanon. The Israeli army starves babies, murders journalists and doctors, bombs hospitals, schools, and residential buildings, and churches and mosques and refugee tents, blows up entire villages, drives bulldozers over children, rapes prisoners, and then declares to the world that it is the true victim. There seem to be no limits to the terror the Israelis inflict, and they're proud of it. They cheer when bombs fall and take pleasure in images of mutilated and dismembered Palestinians and Lebanese. While the behavior is shocking, it's not entirely surprising to those who understand the Zionist project and its history of carrying out terrorist attacks with impunity and stoking civil wars across the region to achieve its objectives, while being pumped with an endless supply of weapons from its Western sponsors who engage in gunboat diplomacy under the guise of endless negotiations. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by As'ad Abukhalil, a Lebanese American professor of political science at California State University. As'ad, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for inviting me, Rania.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on, and there's so much I want to talk to you about. We're going to get to many, many topics, including Israel's history of terrorism, some of the current developments in Lebanon. But before we get started, I just want to give you an opportunity to express how you feel at the moment as we witness the Israelis have essentially forced the displacement of everybody in the Lebanese coastal city of Tyre, also known as Sur, where your family comes from. And they're currently bombing residential buildings in this beautiful, beautiful, ancient coastal city.
Well, I think the feelings are definitely strong, and they range between rage as well as sadness, but it's very important to stay strong in order to accommodate all the developments and to respond to them effectively. And just like you are personally connected to the Lebanese story, we all are, but our feelings and emotions are insignificant in comparison with the emotions and the feeling of the people on the receiving ends of these devastating bombs, whether in Palestine or in Yemen and now Lebanon. And as you know, because we met in the summer in Beirut, Lebanon, the war was still going on. People are unaware that there has been a war going on from October 8th all the way until now. And that war has been barely covered in the US media, except that Hezbollah is attacking Israel. In fact, there is a study which showed 80% of the gunfire exchanged until the so-called failed invasion of Lebanon by Israel 3 weeks ago, 80% of the firepower has been launched by Israel, not by the Lebanese side. And notice also, it's true in Gaza, it's true in Lebanon. Arab resistance group target military sites in Israel, exclusively go after military targets. The Israelis particularly concentrate on civilian targets. This has been the case throughout my lifetime. This is why I am of an age, born in 1960, where the story that Israel suddenly is upset about Hamas or October 7 or about Hezbollah and it's merely responding is totally untrue. It is untrue by virtue of its long history, litany of invasions, of terror, of wars, of war crimes that committed against Lebanese and Palestinians in Lebanon. It's not only the 1982 invasion, it's not only the 96 invasion, the 93 invasion. It is not only the 1972 invasion, barely mentioned, or the 1978 invasion. Series of attacks against Israel. Israel treated Lebanon that it has no sovereignty whatsoever by virtue of its proximity to Palestine. And it punished it consistently since that age. Before there was a PLO, before there was Hamas, before there was Hezbollah, because of its proximity. It's very much Hitlerian. This is why the Nazi analogy is very precise and accurate. There is so much about Israeli ideology, ruling ideology, the founding ideology of Israel that is Nazi-like. There's a racial ethnic hierarchy. They believe in denigration of inferior races and ethnic groups. They believe that no limits to violence should be considered by the state because it has the moral upper ground. And they have practiced it. They have implemented it in their war against the population of Lebanon, Palestine, Syrians, and so on. And also, I want to point out the notion that Hezbollah started this has been proven false. The new book by Bob Woodward, which I've been reading, came out this Tuesday.
Oh, bless you.
Basically, basically admits, yeah, I know it's not an easy order. Basically admits that Israel had a plan to invade Lebanon on October 7, not 8, 7, and that there was a lot of haggling between the United States and Israel in order to calm it down and so on, and purely for American calculation. And also we know now from released leaked information from Israel that they had a plan of the dastardly terrorist method of booby-trapping thousands upon thousands of electronic devices, not only pagers, but walkie-talkies and so and others that we don't know about. From 2015, this has been in place. Israel was humiliated on the battlefield in 2006, and they decided to make up for the defeat by terrorizing the Lebanese population. Even when we were in Lebanon in the summer, I mean, there was a whole population of South Lebanon that has been terrorized by the Israeli army, the genocide army of Israel, I should say. And while many Lebanese were living their lives, going to the beaches, restaurants, and cafes, and so on, they didn't feel it. I mean, now it's different because Israel is going all out and trying the Gaza option on the Lebanese people. It is on the Lebanese people.
Yeah, and I want to get to some of those specifics. I just very quickly, before we get into the history of Israeli terrorism, I want to say, you know, something I've really been reflecting on lately, because you're a bit younger than my mom, but I think you guys are a little bit close in age. And she was actually telling me recently about how when she was growing up in Lebanon, the Israelis would just walk into southern Lebanon whenever they felt like it and kill people, take whatever they wanted, loot things, and leave whenever they felt like it. There was no protection for southern Lebanon. The people of southern Lebanon have always been subjected to horrific Israeli terrorism. But also I've been reflecting on the fact that, you know, I grew up in the US. I was born and raised in the US. I'm Lebanese, but I'm also a product of this country, which I'm sitting in now because I'm having a difficult time getting back to the place I live because it's being bombed by Israel. And it's like you spend your whole life as an Arab American growing up here being gaslit. Like on the one hand, especially if you're Lebanese or Palestinian or Syrian, on the one hand, I grew up watching my family being bombed by Israel. I grew up watching Palestinians be bombed by Israel, people around me being destroyed by Israel. And at the same time, I had to keep my mouth shut to spare the feelings of Zionists because of the Holocaust, which me and my family had nothing to do with. Europeans did that. And so something I notice now is I think there's a generation of Arabs that actually span the age spectrum from young to old who are done. They're done. They're done caring about coddling the feelings of imperialists. And I think that that's actually a really good thing to see happen in the diaspora. And I hope to see more of that. It's just a random comment I want to make. But to the issue of the terrorism that I'm talking about, that we were always gaslit about if we were watching it from this country, is, you know, yes, Israel is really pushing the limits of depravity. I mean, I don't think we've ever seen hospitals be military targets, like in the history of warfare. I could be wrong. Except this is new. This is now. Like, it's like where they literally are targeting hospitals consistently, regularly. There's no protection for them anymore. But even like in medieval times, you didn't see hospitals get looked at as though they're military targets the way Israel has, in addition to preschools and tents and everything. Every part of civilian life is a target. But in many ways, this has always been the case for Israel. And I just want to quote something that you tweeted. You said, "It seems to me that after 1 year of Israeli genocide and wars against 7 countries, you should not be asking as to why October 7th happened. Have you seen what Israel has been doing to the region since the 1930s? I insist on the 1930s because it was then that the Zionist gangs introduced their terrorist techniques and methods." And now I'm also going to pull up another tweet of yours where you actually lay out a really important timeline of some of the most important instances of this terrorism. But I just want to give you the opportunity to talk about it, because here you're citing the bombing of cafes in 1937, the bombing of buses in 1937, bombing of marketplaces in 1938, bombing of hotels in 1946, bombing of foreign embassies in 1946. I mean, and on and on and on. You give specific dates for exactly what and who and where. And just to reference this, you say for documentation, consult the Arab Women's Information Committee and the Institute for Palestine Studies, who are the terrorists, aspect of Zionist and Israeli terrorism. So yeah, I just want to give you the opportunity to talk a bit about that history and why it's relevant today.
Right. So, Rania, I grew up in Lebanon, as you know, and I was very educated about Zionism and the evil of Zionism by virtue of its crimes against Lebanon when I was growing up. I mean, this is a state that in 1974 decided to incinerate a whole refugee camp. The Nabatiya refugee camp does not exist anymore. People don't know it exists. It ever existed because in 1974 it sent private jets and destroyed the entire camp. Israel has been doing this. So they have destroyed hospitals and clinic and killed civilians. They have been doing that all along. The only difference now is the scale of it because Israel is in a state of panic. Recently, they were recording the release of cabinet meetings by Golda Meir. In one of them in 1973, she says something that whenever they cease to be scared of us, we are finished. And I think that's exactly what's driving this brutality and savagery. They realize the Arabs they are facing on the battlefield are not the Arab armies of yesteryears. These are new breed of fighters who have strong resolve, who do not fear death, who do not seek death, but do not fear death. It's not this embrace of a culture of death at all. It is embrace of the culture of life and freedom. They want to be free of the yoke of Zionism. So I knew about Israeli crimes firsthand, and I was not as educated about Zionism and its history. When I first came to Georgetown for my graduate studies, I used to spend the first summer, the second summer, just reading tens of books about Zionism. It is when you read the history of Zionism, you realize that is no accident. The savagery of Zionism is built in the ideology. I mean, they decided to create a state in a place that's already inhabited. How else would you justify the project if you do not denigrate the native population? It's just like slavery. You cannot enslave people unless you tell your people they are inferior. And as a result, our enslavement of them is for their own good because they are not capable of being free on their own. Zionism is exactly that. As early as the late 1890s, Rania, one famous Zionist, Ahad Ha'am, who is the leader of what is known as the School of Cultural Zionism, he went to the Holy Land at the time and came back, wrote scathing articles to Europeans. He said, look what we are doing with the natives. We think they are idiots. We treat them like donkeys. We hit them for no reason. We steal their land. We think they are stupid. He said, but eventually they will realize what we're doing. And of course, the Arabs, very early on, to their credit, they realized what the Zionist project is about, and they were mobilizing against them. They were, building awareness. The press, many of them by Palestinian Christians, were raising awareness about the dangers of Zionism and so on. I mean, there was even a prominent Palestinian, well-known intellectual from the Khaldi family who wrote personally to Theodore Herzl to warn him that there is a native population already lived there. But of course, the Zionists didn't care. Theodore Herzl is somebody who pleaded to Europeans by saying, these are savages. We want to create a place for civilization of Europe in the midst of these backward people, basically. And when he is asked about how are you going to be able to do that with a population that is already have an identity and it is resistance against Zionism. And he quoted the French proverb, qui veut la fin, veut les moyens. He who desires the end desires the means. This is the ideology of Zionism. So for that reason, whenever they met with resistance and opposition by the native, they used brute force, massive scale violence from the very beginning. They were the one who introduced all the methods of terrorism that we complain about in the world today. All of them. Booby trap, car bombs, truck bombs, bus bombs, attacking ambulances, attacking hospitals, clinics, targeting civilians to terrorize them. Menachem Begin in his book, The Revolt, admits that thing. Before the state of Israel declared its fake independence, which is basically a war of conquest and genocide against the Palestinian population, he wrote that in April with the Deir Yassin massacre, that we succeeded. He was bragging about a massacre against civilians, that it basically helped to drive out the local population. And that's what happened with the expulsion, the forced expulsion of the native population. So with that scenario, so they decided that force is our method. Jabotinsky, the famous Zionist leader, he is known for the saying of building a wall, the iron wall against the Palestinian people, the native, using force against them. And of course, he is the ideological founder of revisionist Zionism, to which all the ruling party of Israel today belong. But of course, I make no distinction between left, right, and center in Zionism because they are all the same. They all adhere to the same racist ideology and contempt for the native population. And two, they all believe that there are no limits to the mass violence we inflict on the population in order that we prevail. And that's what they've been doing. I have been looking at the Lebanese newspapers' archives over the last several weeks, just at random. If you open a newspaper any day in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, there's always a story. Israel attacked a village. Israel kidnapped the mayor of this town. Israel attacked fishermen at the sea near Tyre. I mean, they've been doing that. I always post a picture of my grandfather's house, the oldest house in the city of Tyre. This is one of the oldest ancient cities in the world, the longest continuously inhabited cities of all time. Some people say Byblos, some people say Jericho, some people say, I mean, it's one of them. It's one of them. And my grandfather's house has been bombed by Israel 3 times already. It's condemned. I cannot even climb the stairs. That's a long history of Israel. I mark my history as a person by Israeli invasion after 1972 or before. Is it after 1973 Verdun, where they attacked Palestinian leaders, some of them civilians, or after 1978 invasion, 1992 invasion, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I think that's really important to point out because the amount of trauma that Arabs have from this country, all of us, I mean, our lives are marked by this horrific, disgusting Nazi country. I used to refrain from making that comparison again because we're gaslit and conditioned to never sense it. You know, you have to be sensitive to the history of like why Israel was created, even though I'm not, you know, I know Israel was not created as a haven for Jews, but that's what we're told, right? So we have to be sensitive to like Zionists because of this horrible history. But no, you have to call a spade a spade. If it walks like a duck, if it talks like a duck, if it walks like a Nazi and talks like a Nazi, it's a Nazi. And so many, like this is a generational issue. Every generation of my family since the 1940s is traumatized by this U.S. satellite state that's been imposed on us in the Middle East. And, you know, you also write about in one of your tweets, you mentioned a letter bomb, which I thought was interesting because I guess this is before pagers. And I'm just going to read what you said here because I mean, there's so much that we don't know. I mean, you're just spitting out random, big, interesting facts that you've read. We could probably sit here for hours and talk about random terrorist attacks by Israel. But you write in this tweet how heinously indiscriminate the Israeli enemy has been from the very beginning in killing Arabs. In 1972, it sent a letter bomb to Professor Anis, is it Saïr? Saïr, who ran the think tank Palestine Research Center. He had no military role whatsoever. He survived with amputated fingers and loss of hearing. It planted and you talk about it, planted car bombs near that center more than once. A research center. Imagine. Do you see what kind of enemies Arabs have been dealing with? And just that reminds me of the pager attacks because you're talking about someone losing their hands, but from a letter bomb in this case. And also their hearing. I mean, so many people lost their hands and their eyesight from this pager attack that affected civilians as well. So it's Thousands. It's just on and on and on. And to speak to like, if you open any Arab newspaper, I want to just show this, which Ali Hisham shared. I've also seen you sharing. Sorry, I'm trying to find the share button here. I've also seen you sharing stuff like this, but here's Anahar newspaper on February 21st, 1973. And he puts the English translation between 1968 and 1973, Lebanon faced 2,000 Israeli attacks. And he's noting that's long before Hezbollah even existed. And while Iran was still a pro-Western monarchy. So we have to remember these things because this isn't about Hezbollah. I mean, it is and it isn't. This isn't about Hezbollah specifically or Hamas specifically or Iran specifically. It's about Israel trying to stamp out any resistance to its agenda across the region. And they are willing to use the most depraved methods to do so, all while acting like the victim. It's just completely insane. I want to ask you, though, also something that you tweeted that I did not know about. So if you could expand on it. You noted that I'm just going to read your tweet. We're just doing an episode of reading Assad's tweets. That's what we're doing here. But you say, Netanyahu said that he remembers when Lebanon was a pearl of the Middle East, which he said in his speech a couple weeks ago to the Lebanese people. During that time in 1968, when Lebanon was this pearl, Netanyahu was part of the terrorist unit, which landed at Beirut airport and set the civilian airline fleet ablaze. And he bragged about it later. So I did not know about that. Can you explain what you're talking about there?
Correct. There's so much to say here. There's so much to say. But you're right. I'm glad you mentioned letter bombs because Zionist gangs were the first to introduce the weapon of letter bombs. They were the first to use embassy bombing ever in history when they bombed the British embassy in Jerusalem. So it's a very long history of that. And many Palestinian intellectuals were targeted with letter bombs over the years. And they didn't care how it exploded, who is going to be hurt. Just like you said, the most vicious method of terrorism I've ever heard of, when you booby trap more than 5,000 devices that we know of, more than 5,000. And many of them were health workers, doctors, nurses, and most importantly, people who were among their children, people among their families, and they were off-duty fighters, those of them who were fighters. And according to Israeli and American definition of terrorism, if you are off duty, you are a civilian. That's what they told us. But it seems those rules do not apply in the case of Israel at all. So yeah, Anis Saikh, for example, he is an academic. He got a PhD from Cambridge University, came back to Lebanon. He was a professor. And he also founded the Palestine Research Center and edited the Palestinian Encyclopedia. He never was active in any military activities. He was not part of any Palestinian organization at all. And yet, in one day, he received a letter bomb. When I met him for the first time 20 years ago, I shook his hand and I couldn't but constantly think, this man's fingers have been amputated by a terrorist letter bomb from Israel. And every time I met him, I would think about that. And he always had buzzing in his ears for the rest of his life. They did that. They killed a Palestinian intellectual, academic, Wael Zuaiter in Rome, for example, among many others. Their crimes are numerous. I can't even count them, how many of them did. I mean, look, we now know from an Israeli author, Ronen Bergman, his book Rise and Kill, is that from the 1980s and late 70s, 80s, Israel managed a campaign of car bombs, truck bombs, and donkey bombs. They would sneak them into Lebanon and detonate them in crowded areas and quarters. One of my close friends barely survived the car bomb that targeted Abu Hassan Salami, who Israel blamed for Munich operation of 72, and he had absolutely no link to that whatsoever. It shows you, I mean, Israeli intelligence is not always as great as Western media make it to be. So you're right. I mean, there's a long history of these kind of weapons and methods that they use. As far as Netanyahu's involvement, yeah, in his last book, he bragged about his involvement. In 1968, one night, they came to Beirut airport and they set the entire civilian airline fleet of Middle East Airline ablaze. Just like that. They decided Lebanon should not have airlines. Just like today, they decide that Lebanon should not have an air force. I mean, why do you think US sponsors the Lebanese army and trains it? I mean, we show the fruits of US training of the Lebanese army over the last year. It has played no role whatsoever in the defense of Lebanon. Imagine there are volunteers in South Lebanon who are fighting and dying for the cause of defending Lebanon, while the Lebanese army, receiving aid from the United States and weapons that are insignificant, obsolete mostly, and they are sitting by, watching what's happening like spectators. Even when they are shot at, they are not permitted by the US from firing back. They are not even allowed to issue condemnation of Israeli attacks on their position. That's the extent of complicity, US control of Lebanon. They tell you Lebanon is under Iranian occupation. Tell them it is under American occupation. You can judge it by all the sectors of Lebanon. Do you know in recent weeks, the military attaché of the United States Embassy went around Lebanese airport and walked around and looked every nook and cranny and so on, because he wanted to make sure it's safe for Israel? Can you imagine if an Iranian military attaché is roaming around Lebanese airport and so on, and all the corrupt intellectual class of Lebanon, which is at the mercy of the UAE and the Saudi regime, as you know, controlled by them and so on, they don't raise any alarm over that. They don't raise the hue and cry that they would raise if one. There was recently a statement by the Iranian foreign minister in which he said, I salute the steadfastness of the Lebanese people. All this intellectual class, the Western educated intellectual class of Lebanon, the right and so on, they raised a hue and cry alarm because they said, he is interfering in Lebanon. Because he said, I salute the steadfastness of Lebanon. And all the heavy-handed involvement, interferences by the US is met with no objection by these people whatsoever. The United States told Axios that their government is officially working to take advantage of the Israeli attack to install the head of the Lebanese army as president of Lebanon. They are saying that. They want to arrange for an election under Israeli gun, which is something that America and Israel did back in 1982 in the summer, as you know, when two brothers of the Gemayel family were in succession installed as president against the wishes of the Lebanese people by virtue of the Israeli invasion. But times are different. There is no clowning by Yasser Arafat today. He's not around. And most importantly, the Israeli army could not get to even few meters in South Lebanon. In 1982, within days, they were at the outskirts of Beirut. It's a very different picture. So you're right. It's not about Hezbollah in that Israel is about to exterminate, literally, all Arabs who want to resist its occupation and aggression. But it is about Hezbollah because it has risen to become the most potent, most effective Arab resistance group in the history of Arab opposition to Israel.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about what you just mentioned with reference to what the U.S. is trying to do, because it's a similar script. And I'll also add that Bashir Gemayel, who was installed as president, was then assassinated because the Lebanese people
Within weeks.
Within weeks. And this is at a time when there wasn't, like, the PLO had been defeated. There wasn't really an organized resistance yet to
Correct.
Israel, the organized Lebanese resistance yet. It was just somebody took it upon himself to go kill this guy that was trying to normalize with Israel and basically trying to put a pro-Israel government in charge of Lebanon. And that was at a time when Lebanese resistance was weak. Lebanese resistance today is very strong, and it's also in government, which is why the U.S. is trying so hard to essentially, I mean, I'm not sure regime change is the right word, but it's a bit more complicated than that because Hezbollah is not the regime. But they're trying to reshape the Lebanese government right now.
Exactly. Reconfiguring the political balance of power.
Exactly. So I'm curious if you can talk a bit about that, because I think the fear here, I mean, okay, I'll put it this way. We saw that Netanyahu gave this disgusting speech, video message in English to the Lebanese, essentially telling them either take back your country and make it free from Hezbollah, meaning go kill your own countrymen, or else face, quote, the abyss of a long war that will lead to destruction and suffering like we see in Gaza. So he's saying either start a civil war in your country or we will genocide you. That was the threat, right? That was the ultimatum.
Pretty much.
And then the Americans are essentially helping do this diplomatically, if you will. Gunboat diplomacy, I think, is the term that's used when you're trying to force your will on an adversary while they're, like you said, under the gun, under the Israeli gun in this case, by trying to force Lebanon to choose a president that they like, the head of the Lebanese army, Joseph Aoun. And what's so interesting here is Speaker of the House of Lebanon, Nabi Berri, actually said to the UN Security Council representative to Lebanon, okay, if we need to pick a president, we need to actually convene parliament. Can you guarantee that Israel won't bomb parliament? Because there's Hezbollah members of parliament, like Mohammed Raj. He's going to come. He has to come, because if we're going to convene parliament, you need all members of parliament. Can you guarantee Israel won't bomb parliament? And she was like, no, we can't guarantee that.
Correct.
So he's like, then we can't elect a president. We can't change anything. We can't do anything if you can't even guarantee Israel's not going to kill our MPs. Like, it's just completely insane. But I guess my question here is, and now I'm just commenting, but in the case of civil war, you have Israel displacing over 1 million Lebanese, almost all from the Shia community. Now you've got all these Lebanese Shias who have no homes or who've had to leave their homes, who are in non-majority Shia areas. Israel is bombing these displaced people in some of these areas, like in Zgharta last week, which is a majority Christian area. And obviously they're trying to cause civil unrest. We do see a few cases of a little bit of civil unrest, not to civil war level situation, but the fear is that that's what will happen. So, and I'm just curious your thoughts on the potential for civil war, because this is, aside from Israel just bombing everything, this is the next thing everybody's frightened about.
Yes, I will consider that. If you permit me to digress for a second.
Please.
To speak about something you mentioned earlier about the political climate of the United States. You are right. We, among other Arab Americans, are not as intimidated as our forefathers. When I first arrived in America in 1983, I really used to squirm when I would see many Arab speakers get asked the question, do you recognize Israel? and they would fumble and get flustered and they would not give a straight answer and so on. We have a different generation of people today. You know, a couple of weeks ago, I spoke at the campus, nearby California State University in Fresno, and I was amazed at the energy of the people there. And I commented to them, as usual, when I speak on college campuses in recent years, the leadership of the movement is by women, mostly Palestinian American women, and they are fierce and uncompromising. The reason why they have become the Palestinian activism in America is radical is because in the hands of women. I told them that when it was in the hands of men, it was wishy-washy and moderate, and on the one hand, on the other hand, it's not like that anymore. On the question of the Nazi ideology, like you, I used to strictly avoid any Nazi analogy with Israel. And even when I was in Lebanon, to Arabs, I would always caution against them out of respect for the victims of the Holocaust and also for the uniqueness of the evil of the Holocaust. But now I reached a conclusion that out of respect for the victims of the Holocaust, we need to draw the Nazi ideology, because we should not allow, humanity should not allow Israel to replicate the Nazi model of ideology and practice again against a civilian population. It is for that reason we should not shy away from saying these things, and we should certainly not be intimidated by the Zionist lobby, which resort to the accusation of anti-Semitism, thereby emptying the expression from its true meaning. I mean, the Zionists, by using it for political purposes, have basically gave a field day for real anti-Semites. Because now anti-Semites can express all this hatred of Jewish people without being called on it, because people say, well, the accusation of anti-Semitism are politicized by the Zionist lobby. To get to the question you asked, the real threat of civil war, you're absolutely right about that. Netanyahu basically told the Lebanese people in his infamous address that I am not capable of defeating Hezbollah, obviously. So I am asking you if you can do me a favor by defeating Hezbollah, dying in the mission to defeat Hezbollah for Israel, so that I will be happy. And of course, there were no takers on that. And I want to tell you about the Lebanese scene, because many people are often distracted and deceived by what they see on social media. Because you see a lot of Lebanese that contribute to the propaganda of Israel. But that doesn't speak for all of Lebanon. What I hear from the Lebanese on the ground, and I'm sure you've heard the same, is that on the ground, there's a lot of brotherhood and sisterhood and a lot of solidarity among the people. There has been a lot of welcoming to these refugees. And we should also point out, many of these displaced people are not entirely Shiites. Some of them are Sunnis and some of them are Christians, some of them are Druze as well. So there are attempts by Israel and its agent and by the Saudi media, of course, to try instigate sectarian differences. I mean, imagine the diabolical mind of the Saudi television station Arabiya, which decided to air a documentary on the assassination of Rafiq Hariri, accusing Hezbollah of it again, just like the Israeli accusation at first. And in order to stoke Sunni Shiite conflict in Lebanon, which is not occurring. If anything, Sunni Shiite relationship have been the best it has been for years. And that is due to the brutality and savagery of Israel, which always managed to unite Arabs. And this is what's frustrating the Israeli plans nowadays. And that's why their plan to instigate a civil war is not going to work. I think that there are no takers on that scenario. Lebanese went through a civil war. They saw what it can do. And they know that Israeli hands were present very prominently in the first civil war, 75 to 1990. And now the Israelis are blatantly trying to invite Lebanese into another civil war. And the Lebanese are too wise to accept it, I think.
No, I think that's really, really important. And I'm really proud. Look, I'm really proud of Lebanon right now in so many ways, because people aren't buying it. I think especially a younger generation who wasn't necessarily, there might be some sectarian tensions, but it's not
Correct.
like it was. It's not like it was. And I see so many people of all sects coming out, and even if they don't like Hezbollah politically, like some people I've seen criticizing Hezbollah for the last 10 years are now saying, no, this is an existential war. And I'm Christian, right? Not me personally, but I've seen someone say this, like, I'm Christian. I'm not from the South, but my country's under attack. And I pray every day for the men who are defending it in the South.
Right. Right.
And that's unique. That's a unique situation to see from people, in Lebanon in 2024 versus Lebanon in 1981, let's say, or
correct.
1985. But I also want to point out, though, that you noted something about the sort of intellectual class of Lebanon who are on the Saudi or UAE payroll, or in some cases the US payroll. So there's somebody on Twitter who I really like. He's a former former Lebanese government coordinator to UNIFIL, actually. You probably know him, General Munir Shahada. He tweeted this. He said, "The height of oppression is when you fight the enemy on behalf of the nation, and the nation fights you on behalf of the enemy." And I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think here he's talking about the elements inside Lebanon who are pro-Israel, who want to see a pro-Israel government in Lebanon, who see this as an opportunity. And by the way, these people don't just exist in Lebanon. They are Lebanese people in the U.S., specifically at places like the American Task Force for Lebanon, which is made up of people who are aligned with the fascistic Lebanese forces. And they are very close to both the Democratic and Republican parties. When Kamala Harris meets with Lebanese Americans, that's who she's meeting with, because no one else will meet with her. And they want to use
close to the Israeli lobby.
Yes, they are. They work with them. They work with the pro-Israel Syria lobby as well. And these people are so happy to see Israel use their bombs to take out their political enemies inside Lebanon. I think you would agree with me here, As'ad. As much as I despise Lebanese fascists, I would never be okay with Israel's bombs taking out my political enemies inside Lebanon. That's a fight for Lebanese people to have. And so I find it extremely disgusting. But I just want to ask you about some of I'll start with this. I'll start with the media. There's a media outlet in particular called MTV in Lebanon that's funded by a Lebanese billionaire who's close to the Lebanese. I think he's a billionaire, if not 100 millionaire. He's close to Lebanese forces as politically and ideologically. It's close to the Saudis, this station. And they are essentially trying to stoke hatred and civil unrest and applauding the Israelis when they bomb things. And then you also had an outlet called LBC, which confuses me a little bit. I know they used to be quite right wing, and now they kind of like are and aren't. I don't really understand. You can correct me on that. But they recently did a segment that basically helped Israel try to locate what they were calling like a bunker full of money under a hospital in Beirut. And then you also have the political party I mentioned, Lebanese forces, people like Samir Jaja, you have Kataeb, and people like Sami Jmeya. They're not as powerful as they used to be, but they can cause a lot of danger. And then you have the intellectuals. You can name them if you want. You don't have to. Maybe we shouldn't give them attention, but we see them on Twitter. They are people who they'll sit there and say they're against Israel invading Lebanon. They're against Israel bombing Lebanon, but then they spend all day just talking about how Hezbollah and Iran are the problems. So I'm just curious your thoughts on everything I just mentioned with regard to that internal, I guess, domestic enemy who works with our enemy.
Well, I mean, the Lebanese media scene have always been corrupt, have always been at the mercy of foreign governments. This has been the case since the 1950s and 60s. The United States and the West always have a share in Lebanese media. They use it against communism. I mean, if you look at newspaper in the 1950s and 60s, as I often do, you would be amazed at the anti-communist propaganda that is so laughable, making fun of Lenin many decades after his death in a Lebanese newspaper published in Beirut. I mean, that's absurd. And also Gulf government invested heavily. From 1960 in particular, there was a skirmish between Kuwait and Iraq, 1961, I should say. That's when Gulf governments started investing in Lebanese newspaper, because at the time they were facing the widely popular Nasser. And Nasser was genuinely popular. I mean, he did not have to buy a newspaper or to pay people to support him. You will not find anybody who supports Saudi or UAE regime who is either not paid already or hoping to be paid at some point. Nasser's popularity was for free, which is something that's very novel and that frustrated the governments at the time. So you allude to intellectuals and so on, and you're right. We shouldn't name them because we should name the source, which is the governments. NATO government, because NATO, as you know, NATO governments and Soros are funding many new media in Lebanon. They call them independent media. Whenever you see U.S. government in hearings or so on, or in its report or briefing at the State Department referring to independent media in Ukraine or in Russia and so on, we know it's paid for by NATO government and Soros Foundation. So we have many of them, plethora of them in the Arab world. And there are segments of these media that are controlled by the Gulf and or NATO and Soros Foundation that have been doing their job in servicing the Israeli war effort. And it's been very blatant. And Lebanon is genuinely free to the point it's totally unrestrained. I mean, look to Israel, how much restriction and censorship there are about a war situation. They only waited for such a
Yeah.
long time before they admitted that it was a drone from Hezbollah which hit directly the residence of Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, and all the media of Israel, without any protestation, they oblige and obey the military censor. In Lebanon, there are no censors. We are truly the freest country in the Middle East. And unfortunately, that has its drawback in wartime because you are basically facing media outlets that are paid or controlled by foreign agendas that are tied to Israel. The case of the first station you mentioned, MTV, it has a very checkered past, very corrupt past. And in fact, Al Akhbar newspaper years ago published a Saudi diplomatic document in which the MTV owner made a very desperate plea for a 5 million investment by the Saudi government in MTV. And so we know it's paid, it's funded by these Gulf sources, and they are doing the job on behalf of these governments. LBC, it's a different story altogether, and it is as sinister in the role it plays. It was founded, in fact, by Israel. People don't know this history of it.
What?
Israel gave Bashir Gemayel the equipment to launch the first Lebanese TV station that is not owned by the government, the first private TV station. So they gave them all the boxes, and it started in the 1980s by the man who used to be the liaison officer between the Lebanese forces and the Israeli invading army in the mountain war of Lebanon in mid-1980s. So that's how it started. Of course, because he's a businessman first and he wants money, he later tried to pretend that he is not on the first original mission of serving the Israeli agenda and so on. And he got money from Gulf government and he had investment from Lebanese politicians and so on. So he tried to steer it away. But during this war effort, during this war situation, we see the true colors of all these medias. But the one that are playing the most prominent roles, as you have heard, are the Saudi-owned station, like MBC, Al Arabiya, Al Hadath. And that's why BDS has officially called for the launch of boycott of all these outlets, namely Al Arabiya, Al Hadath, MBC, which is an empire. It's the largest media empire in the Arab world, which is owned by the Saudi government, and MTV and LBC in Lebanon. So people are being aware of it. And when the dust settles, I mean, there's going to be a repercussion. There are people who lost their families under the rubble of bombing in buildings based on false claims by MTV or some other station. People are going to ask for accountability. I mean, people are dying because of this propaganda that originates in Israel and get reverberated in these media outlets. So it's a very dangerous game they're playing. And I fear there will be retributions later by virtue of what they are doing. So that's why one calls, and I did call, I mean, who am I? But I called on the Minister of Information to take a role in trying to rein in these media outlets.
Ziad Makari.
And
So far, so I've heard from some of my own sources that part of the argument from people in the Lebanese government from disciplining these outlets, specifically the domestic ones at least that are internally Lebanese, is that if they shut them down or discipline them in any way, they'll be accused by the US of doing it on Iran's behalf, which just shows, I mean, there's just such a ridiculous fear of the US. It's a wartime situation. And this presents a security threat to all Lebanese people when you have outlets literally telling Israel where to bomb and telling people to kill each other. I mean, it's completely insane. They would be well within their right to shut it down. Any country would. It's not about press freedom. But all that, go ahead.
The US is a hypocrite on all manners of freedom of speech. In the history of US involvement in the Middle East, it has always fallen on the side of crackdown against freedom of speech because it doesn't want outlets that are critical of the United States and Israel. I mean, I heard from the director of Al Jazeera 15 years ago, Waddah Khanfar, he told me that the US ambassador in Doha, Qatar, presents him every month with a report in which the US government evaluates the performance of Al Jazeera and makes suggestions that can be to the benefit of the state of Israel and its image in the Arab world. Most importantly, the US government pressured the entire Arab League, which is run by the Gulf government, in order to crack down and shut out from cable services throughout the Arab world any station that promotes resistance to Israel. This is why you cannot get any media that are propagating resistance to Israel in any Arab country that is coming through the official cable system of the region. That's why people find ways to go around it to listen to them.
Yeah, you have to get satellite to get Mayadeen or literally or Manar or anything else. But
or
I
online.
want to, well, I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak to an issue that I think is important for people to understand. This is kind of a twofold question. First, there's this idea that why don't you just stop fighting Israel? The problem is that you're fighting Israel. Just stop and they'll stop killing you. And obviously that's ridiculous. But I just also want to ask you, because I don't know, is there any time in the history of since Israel's creation where surrendering to Israel has caused Israel to stop killing Arabs? I actually am reminded of the PLO leaving Lebanon in 1982, right? That was technically a surrender. They left. With guarantees. They were given assurances, by the way, written assurances that the U.S. would make sure no harm came to the hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees who remained. And what happened after that? Lebanese Zionists, under Israeli protection, murdered over 3,000 Palestinians and some Lebanese in Sabra and Shatila, who were completely defenseless. And that comes to
Correct.
mind when I think of people saying, why just stop fighting? Go ahead, please.
Yes, there is a historical example of when Arabs surrendered to Israel, what will happen to them. And that example is 1982 in Lebanon. I mean, before I answer this question, let me say something, because I really worry, because we spoke about the civil war. I really am very concerned about that scenario. And I hope nobody in Lebanon goes in that direction. And I know there are media outlets that are paid from the outside that are trying to stoke sectarian differences and mobilization against Hezbollah and others. I don't think it's safe for anybody in Lebanon. I genuinely, sincerely want peace and stability for the country and its people that have gone through a lot from Israel and from internal differences. And Israel has never been a bystander. In all civil conflict in Lebanon, Israel was directly involved, as well as the Shah of Iran. Do you know, in 1958, when there was a civil war, there was no PLO interference, but Israelis and the Iranian of the Shah were funding and arming the fascist militias of Lebanon. And those fascist militias, the Phalange and the Lebanese forces, are the ones who always bring in outside interferences. In 1976, they were the ones who dragged the Syrian army to save their behinds because they were being defeated by the PLO coalition in Lebanon. And in 1980s, they were the ones who invited Israel into Lebanon. Not that Israel needs any invitation to invade any country, of course. Now, so I hope that they don't do that. And they should not assume, because Hezbollah is momentarily weaker than before, that they will be reluctant to fight back at some point. I don't want that to happen. I don't want them to fight back against fellow Lebanese. But you should not provoke them when they are wounded. And that's what I see in Lebanon happening. And also, I want to always mention what Imad Mughniya, the military commander of Hezbollah for much of its years, and the second in command under Hassan Nasrallah, he was asked when Nasrallah was alive once, what would happen if Nasrallah is assassinated? And he famously said, if Nasrallah is assassinated, you should know that you basically have killed the one reasonable man among us. You know, so one should be careful in trying to provoke these people now, because you feel they are down. They are down, but they are not finished, obviously, by the record of the performance on the battlefield and the fact that Israel could not advance into Lebanon. To answer your question specifically, what happens when Arabs surrender? I witnessed it, and I hate to remember how I witnessed it. In 1982, Israel flattened a residential building next to our house. We were in a middle-class Muslim neighborhood in West Beirut, and Israel flattened suddenly a whole residential building, crushing everybody in between. They used concussion bombs. And so as a result, we had to relocate to Hamra and relocate again another place. And then my family had to go to East Beirut for safety. My sister and I did not want to go to East Beirut. We went to a village east of Tyre where my aunt was residing at the time. And at that time, I was really horrified to see the Shiites of Lebanon predominantly were surrendering to Israel. They had white sheets on the top of all their houses, and they all assumed that Israel is going to rescue them. Many of them were very anti-Palestinian, were unhappy about PLO conduct, which was not good at all at the time in Lebanon. It alienated many of the Lebanese population. It created a fertile ground for the Israelis to come and invade Lebanon. So at that time, I lived in that village for several months, and I would preach against Israel and Zionism. And many of them would tell me, like, we're fed up with that rhetoric. We just want to live. We just want peace. And I tell them, there will not be peace under these people. This Israeli army will not peace. They despise you. They hold you in contempt. Just look at the history, how they dealt with Palestinians. I mean, look how they dealt with Palestinian peaceful pacifists. I always tell the story of Mubarak Awad because I knew him in Washington, D.C. He was a Quaker minister, Palestinian American. He wanted to preach pacifism. And I used to argue with him about that because I don't believe that pacifistly you can resist Israeli aggression and brutality. So he went to Jerusalem and he established a center for nonviolence. What happened to Mubarak Awad? Israel accused him of terrorism and kicked him out of the country. So the Shiites of Lebanon in 1982 predominantly surrendered to Israel. And I used to tell them, wait until the next season of oranges. When you pick up the oranges, you will see your economy destroyed and you will see how they will mistreat you. And sure enough, they brought into their lives the highly criminal South Lebanon army, which wreaked havoc in those villages, raped women, attacked people, tortured little children, and so on. And as a result, within 1 year, Rania, I was back then in Beirut, within 1 year, they started to mount resistance against Israel, and every known collaborator with Israel in every village of South Lebanon was mysteriously killed. Every one of them. This is a chapter that people don't talk about. Even the villages, whenever I mention it, people in villages near Tyre tell me, please don't mention it. It's embarrassing to this family. I don't care. People should know that there is no reward for collaboration with the enemy or for cooperation with the enemy or for pinning hope on an enemy that hold you in utter contempt. This is an enemy that has a proven long record of treating Arabs like animals. And as a result, if Arabs do not stand up against Israel, our destiny is in jeopardy. I mean, this is why I've always believed that Antoun Saadi, the founder of the Syrian Social National Party, was right. That this is not a border dispute we have with Israel. It is an existential conflict. Israel does not want the Arabs to live, as we witness in Gaza. They are killing them because they want the largest number of them to die. They were not going after Sinwar. They killed Sinwar by accident. They were killing thousands and thousands of people in the hope that maybe Sinwar will be one of them.
No. I appreciate all that, and that's something else I want to ask you about. Well, first of all, I do want to say that there's two types of people I've seen recently kind of crop up in terms of how they're viewing this and talking about the Lebanese. Because over the last decade, you and I both know that the U.S. and Europeans, they spent so much money in Lebanon trying to convince all kinds of people that Israel isn't really the big threat anymore. You know, the real problem for Lebanon is Iran, is corruption, it's Syria, it's these things and like nothing else, right? And if only we could just like change that, everything would be fine. Israel's it doesn't matter anymore, right? And it kind of started to work on some people, maybe even, many people. And you started to see people that maybe used to be more pro-resistance were like, we don't really need Hezbollah anymore. It's not important anymore. It's actually an obstacle to Lebanon being like Switzerland or being like Dubai, or being like a Western democracy, like, some European country. That's something that we can like emulate. And then, there was those who already hated Hezbollah, who hated it even more. But the point is just to say that Israel was kind of becoming this enemy that isn't really our enemy. That was like the enemy of our parents, right? Because there hasn't been a war since 2006. But
thanks to the presence of a military force that is a volunteer army that humiliated the Israeli army and prevented it from entering Lebanon, which is the same military force preventing it now. I mean, whatever Lebanese may think of Hezbollah domestically, and you and I have many criticism of the role of Hezbollah in Lebanese politics. I mean, they have aligned themselves with corruption. The list is very long. But when it comes to defending the people of Lebanon, who else? I mean, who else is there? And when I was young, there was no Hezbollah. The people of South Lebanon were defending South Lebanon. They were at the time members of PLO organization. They were getting any weapon. They were getting the help from any way they want, from anywhere that's available. Back then, a lot of countries were giving weapons to the people of South Lebanon. Now there's only one country. And this is why the United States and Gulf governments spent billions, literally, in their media to mobilize people against Hezbollah, to mobilize them, and to tell them Israel is not the enemy, it is Iran. You're right, there are takers, but remember this, the Lebanese intellectual class, these NGO types, it's the most corrupt group in society. These were the people who are tied to the banks. Is there anything more corrupt to the bank? You have bankers who are funding magazines and TV stations and so on. And as a result, they are the master's voice. They are not their own voice. And that's why I think we should not name them and name the
No,
real
no, no. But I don't want to
sponsors.
name them. I don't want to name
Right,
them.
right,
But
right.
what I want to say is there are people that I've seen who are now like back to being like, okay, yes, we actually do support resistance. Israel
Correct.
is the
I've seen
enemy.
people flip
And
back.
this is what I'm happy to see. And to them, I just want to say, welcome back. Like, I don't want to antagonize anybody who maybe got it wrong 5 years ago or
Correct.
was a little bit misled, because we now know, like you said, Israel is reminding everybody that they are an existential threat to all of us. And we can't have a better country when Israel and America's boot is literally on our necks. Like, there's no creating or developing Lebanon and making its political system better while this existential genocidal fascist state exists next to you and is constantly trying to destroy you. As long as it's a threat, we will need resistance. And also, Lebanon, like, I would love to have a Lebanese army that can defend the country, but like you mentioned earlier, we are blocked from having that by the US. In fact, I think it's important to note that when it comes to 1701 and having UNIFIL and like Lebanese army take over the South and making Hezbollah like his presence, like, or making basically like eradicating Hezbollah's presence from the South, not that you can ever really do that, is all about using the Lebanese army and UNIFIL to basically do Israel's work. Like, why aren't we calling
Totally.
for an international force to go to Israel and make sure that they stop bombing everyone? It's really incredible, Assad. Everything's always in the context of Israel's security. And I've really reached a point where I've never in my political life, as a journalist, as an activist, whatever you want to call me, I've always been against any military intervention because it's usually led by the US and it's usually wrong and it's usually meant to do something
Right.
nefarious. I've never seen a case that needs it needs a few things. It either needs military intervention to stop Israel, which is what Hezbollah is trying to do, or we need to stop the US from giving Israel weapons. I don't know what stops this country at this point. You have a genocide in Gaza that is so shockingly horrific. I'm having nightmares about it. I don't know about you, but I literally have
Me too.
nightmares about what's happening in North Gaza right now.
We
I
all
am
are.
so
We all are.
I am so scared for Lebanon. And I want to ask you one thing I'll ask you about last before I get your thoughts on this is how the situation in South Lebanon is right now from your perspective. But I'm so scared for Lebanon. And this is a Nazi country that will continue to expand and destroy everything around it until it's stopped. And people keep asking me, how do we stop this? How do we stop this? And I don't know what to tell them anymore. I genuinely don't know what to tell them anymore.
I mean, basically, I think that everybody in their own capacity, whatever they are, should do at least lending their voice to the cause against the Nazi cruelty and savagery by Israel. And I think you're right. You mentioned how everybody talks about Israel's security, and you have to guarantee Israel's security. Notice the left in this country or in Europe, for example, the Green Party of Germany or Bernie Sanders. They always speak about Israel's right to self-defense, Israel's security. The reason they never mention Palestinian security, because they are racist. I mean, there's no other explanation, right? They are racist. They don't think we are worthy of living. They don't think our security matters. They think that our existence as Arabs is purely to provide Israel with assurances of security. I mean, people of South Lebanon, their only reason of living, raison d'etre, is to basically feel Israel feel secure by basically allowing Israel to enter into the country like it used to do, to kidnap people, interrogate them, torture them, and so on. That's how I lived my life as a child and as a boy. Israel was doing that on a regular basis. Of course, that's not going to fly because the rules of the game are different. Arabs are not afraid of Israel anymore. The situation of South Lebanon is very impressive, Rania, from the standpoint of Lebanese sovereignty. Despite the ferocious firepower of Israel, of 3 weeks of bombing, destroying villages wholesale, destroyed the historic market of Nabatea entirely, a market that existed more than a century and a half ago, was 5,000 people were going there late 19th century. So destroyed all that. They don't care about any relic of life for Arabs because they're racist. And yet, they could not advance into Lebanese territory. They advance and they leave for like few meters, take a picture and then go back because they are that afraid. And I think the resistance is extremely stiff and there are still operations every single day. But, do you know what Israel does when it's frustrated? They take it out on civilians. They kill civilians. We are talking about a state that is willing to flatten 6 residential buildings to kill 1 man. I mean, I know no scale of savagery that has been exceeded as much as Israel has done in the last year.
No, it's utterly shocking. And I have to say, I titled this episode "Every Israeli Accusation" as a confession because literally
So true.
everything they accuse us of is a confession. They talk about Hamas mass rape. We know it never happened. And what is Israel doing? It is raping Palestinians as punishment as they hold them in concentration camps. And it's probably going to do the same to any Lebanese people it takes from the south.
Right. I mean, not only they rape Palestinian prisoners, they debate it. I mean, there are people, on both sides, like, I think debate is a good method and we should go ahead with that. People are advocating rape. This is why Israel is really the only fake and rape democracy in the Middle East. It's not the only democracy in the Middle East. It's the only fake and rape democracy of the region. You're absolutely right.
Army of rapists. They say that Arabs cooked Jewish babies and beheaded them. That's actually what they're doing. And at this point, saying things like Palestinians, Arabs, whatever, cook Jewish babies. I hear it the same way when I hear someone say that Jews drink the blood of children.
Exactly. And
it's a blood libel.
When people ask about October 7th, and people often ask me, and I say, you know what? If you don't want to argue with the facts, because we know the facts, how much Israel lied and how much the American president lied and Kamala Harris lied and Bernie Sanders lied about what happened October 7th, let us defer the matter to an international impartial investigation. Guess who called for one? Hamas officially. Mm-hmm. In their long document that they released long after October 7th, they said, we accept an international investigation. Guess who doesn't? The country that believes it alone is qualified to investigate itself, and it always exonerates itself of crimes, always.
No, 100%.
And we have Supreme Court of Israel that basically goes along with the government 99% of the time. So,
I also just want to note real quick, you mentioned the president and keeps repeating he does, both Biden and Kamala repeat the beheading and the rape lie. Kamala repeatedly says the rape lie, even though she knows it's a lie. But one thing I saw was the father of the child who was killed. Was it in Chicago or near Chicago? The Palestinian 6-year-old, American 6-year-old who was killed early on in the genocide by his neighbor who stabbed him and his mother and stabbed the child to death.
Repeatedly.
Repeatedly. The father was saying in a video I saw recently that the neighbor was inspired to lynch these people because he heard Biden saying that Palestinians beheaded babies on October 7th. So Joe Biden provoked a lynching of a child. And there's just no repercussion. There's consequences to repeating these lies. There are real consequences.
Joe Biden is guilty for much more than that one crime. I mean,
he's
guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity throughout this war.
One of many. Yeah. But I wanted to ask you to comment on the recent deaths of two people before we wrap here. And I'll start with Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, who was, as you said, accidentally killed by the Israelis last week because he was on the front lines fighting, which is something you would never see from any Western military commander or leader. They often send other people to go do the fighting for them. And I actually just want to quote a few things that Yahya Sinwar said in an interview that was released back in 2018. It was in writing. He was asked, "What kind of life do you hope for your children?" And Yahya Sinwar responded, "A life as Palestinians, of course, head high, always. Despite it all, I hope they will be strong and keep on struggling till the day they get freedom and independence. Because I want my kids to dream of becoming doctors, not to treat only the wounded, but cancer patients. Like all of the kids of the world, I want them to be safely Palestinians so that they can be much more than Palestinians." And then he also added, when the interviewer called Hamas a militia, he said, "I'm not the leader of a militia. I'm from Hamas. And that's it. I am the Gaza leader of Hamas, of something much more complex than a militia, a national liberation movement. And my main duty is to act in the interests of my people, to defend it and its right to freedom and independence." He responded to the journalist, "You're a war correspondent. Do you like war?" She said, "Not at all." And he said, "So why should I? Whoever knows what war is doesn't like it." She responds, "But you've been fighting for all your life." And he says, "And I'm not saying I won't fight anymore. Indeed, I'm saying that I don't want war anymore. I want the end of the siege. You walk to the beach at sunset and you see all these teenagers on the shore chatting and wondering what the world looks like across the sea, what life looks like. It's breaking, and it should break everybody. I want them free." And then he also added something that I think was really important. She said, "Borders have been basically sealed off for 11 years. Gaza doesn't even have water anymore, only seawater. How is living here?" Yahya Sinwar responds, "What do you think? 55% of the population is under 15. We are not speaking of terrorists. We're speaking of kids. They have no political affiliation. They have just fear. I want them free. I mean, this man's words sound really important to me. He was quite a revolutionary figure, and I think has gone down as one as he's been killed. And so I'm just curious your thoughts on Yahya Sinwar, who's become a bit of a legend because Israel very stupidly released the footage of his last moments where he fought until his last breath. Go ahead.
It totally backfired on by Israel. In 1972, when it killed Ghassan Kanafani, who was 36, not a lot of people in the Arab world knew who he was, or in the world at large. Do you know the legend of Ghassan Kanafani today? How many friends you have on social media, you and I have, where the profile picture is one of Ghassan Kanafani. Look how much his saying and wisdom is being circulated around the world. We just launched a new book of his translation of political writings by Ghassan Kanafani for the first time in English, and I recommend people to get it. You're right. I think the person who decided to release that video will be court-martialed at some point in Israel, because there is a legend of Sinwar, the likes of which I have not seen in my lifetime. Just yesterday, Israeli occupation forces invaded Nablus, and an 11-year-old kid came out of his house and he yelled, "Hear ye, I am Sinwar." And he threw rocks at the Israelis. And of course, he was shot to death by the Israelis. So there is a whole movement being inspired by Sinwar throughout the Arab world. And this is somebody who has been vilified throughout this war by Gulf media and Israeli media. They said that he is living in luxury in his underground. They said that he has never fought against the Israelis. They said that he has been negotiating for his personal safety. And now we know all that was true. Now we know he was offered safe passage, and he refused to. And he died literally to the last breath fighting the Israeli occupation. This is a man who suffered for many years under Israeli occupation, who made it his duty to fight not against Israeli occupiers, but against also the collaborators of Israel. And that's why he was much better at protecting the security of his movement than Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is a whole different story, because Lebanon is much open society and so on, where Israeli spies can go in and out, and the Lebanese government never arrests them. Just recently, they arrested an Israeli 2 weeks ago, and they let him go. And
they gave him to the U.S.
Yeah. They do that routinely. I mean, that's why I said to you, the Lebanese government is run by the United States. Large segment of it is run by the United States, really, literally. So I think the Sinwar legend is going to grow. I think that he's going to inspire a lot of movements. A lot of movements will be named after him, and a lot of movements will be modeled on the path of Sinwar. So in many ways, we are not done with the phenomenon of Sinwar. If anything, it will grow. And now with the release of his last testimony, which is being circulated widely, you will see a lot of references to him in political speeches, political rhetoric, and so on, for many years to come. Israel is always, the hubristic mentality of Israel is such that they think we can finish off a movement or a phenomenon by killing one person. And they killed thousands of people under those terms. And it never works. It never works. And I think Nasrallah is the same story. He will inspire more people in Lebanon to fight against Israel, modeling themselves on the example of Nasrallah leadership of a movement that defeated Israel.
Yeah, and I also just wanted to ask you if you could maybe elaborate a bit more on Nasrallah, since that's somebody that you did get to meet at one point in time. He's somebody that has been on the television. I mean, look, every Lebanese person watches his speeches for the last 30 years, whether they like him or not, actually, because what he says matters, what he said mattered. And now he's gone, and I think his assassination is definitely going to be seen as we move forward, the end of a certain era of Hezbollah, and then preceding the beginning of a new one that we're starting to witness now. And like you've said in a recent piece for El Akhbar, like history is being written as we speak, and we have to kind of wait and see what takes place because nothing is guaranteed. But that said, I'm just curious your thoughts on the killing of Nasrallah, who, again, another revolutionary figure. People can hate him all they want, but I think you could definitely call him revolutionary. He impacted not just Lebanon, but the region and in many ways the world.
Well, as you said, I got to interview him several times, and I have a feeling about his personality. Sinwar, I never knew. I watched him from afar, and a close friend of mine describes Sinwar as a raw person, in the sense that He is not manufactured. He is not artificial. He is somebody who's true about what you get, what you see is what you get, as they say, the American cliche. And he is self-educated, and he studied Zionism. He learned Hebrew and so on. And if I were to compare the two, I would say this is the common theme. These are two people who realize that fighting Israel requires knowledge of Israel. I mean, in the case of Sinwar, learning Hebrew, reading all their books, and study and translating. He translated Hebrew book himself while in prison. Nasrallah, the same thing. I mean, I asked him once, what do you read per day? And he told me, I'm consumed. I wish I can have more time to read literature or even religious studies, because it's part of my job as a cleric to constantly read religious material. He said, I have no time, or I have less time for that, because I consumed for many hours of the day by reading about Israel, reading about Hebrew translations and studies and so on. At one point, he started learning Hebrew even. He took it that seriously. Nasrallah is a different figure in that he became a regional figure, and he was a very looming presence in people's lives, even the ones who hated him, because he came and commented on news development. I mean, sometimes I felt like I wish you wouldn't comment on internal Lebanese matters about garbage collection and scandal and all that stuff, and you stick to strategic matters and so on. But who am I to say what he should or what should not say? But people listened to every word of his. He had tremendous impact. He inspired people, and I think he will continue to inspire people. And I think the only analogy I can make in my lifetime about the absence of a regional political figure is the death of Nasser of 1970. Because Nasser was a huge presence in people's lives, and certainly in my family's lives, inspired us, influenced us. And we listened back then to transistor radio for speeches if they were not available on TV. Nasrallah, however, will live longer than Nasser for a simple reason. One, in the age of video, there are going to be all these available speeches of his that will be circulated widely and so on. And the second is, Nasser did not leave a political party and did not leave institutions. And that's why, unfortunately, Sadat and the Americans were able to rearrange Egypt and redirect it towards Israel very quickly after the death of Nasser of 1970. In the case of Nasrallah, it's different. He left an institution. He knew about his own mortality. I mean, he famously said, people like me don't live long. And he was right. I mean, when you join Hamas, when you join Hezbollah, you knew that you are risking your life forever. You are a marked man, or even woman, because they kill women as well, as you know. If you join the Lebanese Communist Party or the Socialist Party or the Green Party of Lebanon, I mean, there's no risk. The real risk is to join these two movements, because Israel is going to try to kill every single member of these movements. So he knew about his destiny, and it is for that reason he prepared for his absence already. I mean, he had a system whereby everybody has an assistant and a deputy assistant. And that's why when Israel decapitated some of the leadership, there were people who take their stead, and they were assuming their responsibilities already as we speak. But I think that Israel will discover within years and so on that they will deal with Nasrallah and Sinwar even in death, just like as they dealt with them when they were alive. But more importantly, I will say the following. The United States will also get to suffer the consequences of its complicity in the assassination of Nasrallah. I have no doubt about it. I think when the dust settles, we will witness what I call wars of revenge in Nasrallah's name. There are people who are going to be very angry and who's going to take it out on people they thought are accomplices. And the United States made no bone about its own involvement in this war from the very beginning, whether against Hezbollah, supplying intelligence, participating with their men on the ground in Gaza. And of course, nobody mentions about that highly suspicious humanitarian, what do you call it, floating pier, the floating pier of Gaza.
Right, I forgot about
now
that.
Now we know it was a covert operation by the United States to help and assist the Israelis in their war of genocide. So I think
Disgusting.
that Biden has committed the United States to deadly, fatal repercussions that will be with us for many years to come, longer than the repercussion of the Bush's invasion of Iraq in 2003.
Yeah, I don't think people should underestimate the fact that people who are running policy are actually mediocre idiots. Like, they're not very smart. They're mediocre idiots.
Or
Go ahead.
smart idiots, or smart
Or,
idiots.
I
They
mean,
know
maybe
how
they
to
can
be
take
idiots.
tests. They can take tests well. They can take
Right, right,
tests
right.
well, but they're still
No,
mediocre,
no, no, no.
very
Uh,
average.
Not in the case of Joe Biden for sure, because in law school he
Oh,
is
he
known
can't
to
take.
cheat. Yeah. No, he cheated in law school. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. I'm
Oh,
not
yeah, yeah.
surprised though.
He's a
Not surprised.
plagiarizer. He's a plagiarizer, and he's a cheater, and so on. Yeah, yeah.
Well, As'ad, are there any final words you want to leave people with as we? Because I know for me, for example, every single day sometimes I wake up in the night to check the news. I mean, I just like
Yeah, all of
I
us, all
can't.
of
My
us.
life revolves around checking the news on Lebanon and Gaza.
Final words.
Yes.
I know many of you out there are in a state of despair. I know many people are in a state of depression. I know revolutionaries who are sad about what has happened. The last year was very difficult on all of us. However, take all that emotion, take all that energy, and direct it in a positive direction. Do your share to help this fight of justice against Zionism. You have many years ahead of you. I don't know what your age is, but you can contribute. And this cause is very just and it's worthy of your attention and your devotion. And I guarantee you, in my lifetime, I've never been more confident that the Zionist project is doomed. It cannot survive. It is not sustainable. And what they have done the last year in terms of savagery is more than ever guarantee the demise and the dismantlement of the Zionist project in Palestine. Palestine shall be free from the river to the sea, where
As'ad,
everybody can be
oh,
equal, whether they are
yes.
Jewish, Christians, and Muslim, and there will be no specter of Zionist terrorism over their lives. Thank you.
Asad, that was so beautifully said. And I think everybody needs to hear that and stick to it. You know, we all give pep talks all the time, but we also all need them because it is important. It's a just cause. And I feel exactly what you're feeling. I think that Israel's not sustainable. It's just a matter of how much destruction before it's dismantled at this point. But all that said, can you also just tell people where they can follow your work?
I'm on Twitter. You can put my name.
Yeah.
Right.
Follow As'ad Abukhalil on Twitter. Your tweets are incredible. Your articles are incredible. As'ad, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Rania. Take care.